Margaret Santos stepped out of the old taxi and looked up at the biggest house she had ever seen. The morning fog hung low over the hills, making the mansion look like something from a fairy tale. But this wasn't a fairy tale. This was her new job, and she desperately needed it to work out. The taxi driver helped her pull a worn suitcase from the trunk. Everything she owned fit inside that one bag. 2 years ago, she had a house full of furniture, family photos, and memories. Now she had 3 changes of clothes, a few personal items, and $27 in her wallet. "You sure this is the right place, lady?" the driver asked, looking at the iron gates and perfectly trimmed hedges. "This looks like where rich folks live." Margaret nodded and handed him her last $10 bill. She watched the taxi disappear down the winding driveway, taking with it her last connection to the outside world. Now she was truly alone. The front door was twice as tall as any door she'd ever seen. Before she could knock, it opened. A thin man in a black suit stood there. His hair was perfectly combed and his shoes shined like mirrors. "You must be Mrs. Santos," he said in a voice that sounded like he was reading from a script. "I am Robert, the head butler. Mr. Whitmore is expecting you." Margaret followed Robert through hallways lined with paintings that probably cost more than she used to make in a year. The floors were so clean she could see her reflection. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that seemed to go on forever. "Mr. Whitmore owns 3 technology companies," Robert explained as they walked. "He works from home most days. He values his privacy and expects the same from his staff." They stopped in front of another massive door. Robert knocked twice. "Come in," came a voice from inside. Jonathan Whitmore sat behind a desk the size of a small car. He was younger than Margaret expected, maybe in his early 50s, with gray hair and tired eyes. He looked up from his computer screen for exactly 3 seconds. "Mrs. Santos, your duties are simple. Clean the house, don't touch anything valuable, don't make noise during business hours. Robert will show you to your room." He looked back at his screen. "That's all." Margaret wanted to say something, maybe introduce herself properly, but Robert was already guiding her toward the door. In her previous jobs, the homeowners at least shook her hand. Mr. Whitmore hadn't even looked at her long enough to see her face. Her room was in the staff quarters, small but clean. It had a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the garden. After 2 months of sleeping on her sister's couch, having her own space felt like a luxury. Robert handed her a uniform and a list of rules. "Breakfast is at 6. Work begins at 7. Mr. Whitmore doesn't like to see the staff unless necessary. Stay quiet and stay invisible." That first morning, Margaret learned just how big the house really was. 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, 3 kitchens, a library, a gym, and rooms she couldn't even identify. Everything was perfect, like a museum where no one actually lived. But it was the living room that stopped her in her tracks. In the center of the room sat the most beautiful piano she had ever seen. It was black and shiny, with ivory keys that seemed to glow in the morning light. A small brass plate on the side read, "Steinway & Sons, 1923. Margaret's fingers tingled. She hadn't touched a piano in 2 years, not since she'd sold hers to pay for David's hospital bills. That piano had been her most precious possession, a wedding gift from her parents. Selling it had broken her heart almost as much as losing her husband. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Margaret jumped. Robert had appeared behind her like a ghost. "Yes, it's stunning," she whispered. "Mrs. Whitmore used to play it every evening. She died 15 years ago. Mr. Whitmore had it moved here from their bedroom, but no one's touched it since." Margaret ran her dust cloth over the piano's surface, being extra careful. She wondered what songs Mrs. Whitmore used to play. Were they sad songs or happy ones? Did Mr. Whitmore used to sit and listen? The house felt heavy with sadness. Family photos sat face down on tables. Rooms that should have been filled with laughter echoed with emptiness. It was like walking through a place where happiness used to live but had packed up and left long ago. Over the next few days, Margaret learned the rhythm of the house. Mr. Whitmore woke up early and worked until late. He ate his meals alone in his office. He never watched TV, never had visitors, never seemed to do anything except work. The other staff members were nice enough, but they didn't talk much. Robert ran the house like a military operation. The cook, Mrs. Chen, prepared meals that Mr. Whitmore barely touched. The gardener, Tom, kept the grounds perfect even though no one ever walked through them. Margaret found herself thinking about the piano more and more. Sometimes, when she was cleaning nearby rooms, she would stop and stare at it. Her fingers would move slightly, remembering old songs. She could almost hear the music in her head, but she kept her distance. This job was too important to risk. At 52, with no money and no family to help her, she couldn't afford to make mistakes. She needed this job to survive. Still, every time she walked past that piano, something inside her heart stirred. It was like seeing an old friend you're not allowed to talk to. The music was still there, waiting. The piano was still there, silent, but ready. Margaret didn't know it yet, but that piano was about to change everything. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret first walked through those giant doors. She had settled into a routine that felt both comfortable and lonely. Wake up at 5:30, quick shower, breakfast with the other staff, then 8 hours of making. An already perfect house even more perfect. The piano haunted her thoughts. Every morning when she dusted the living room, she would spend an extra minute looking at it. Sometimes she would accidentally brush against the keys while cleaning, and the soft sound would make her heart jump. She would quickly look around to make sure no one heard, even though the house was usually empty during the day. Margaret had started having dreams about playing again. In her sleep, she would sit at that beautiful Steinway and play all the songs she used to love. She would wake up with her fingers moving as if they were still touching the keys. The dreams felt so real that sometimes she had to check her hands to make sure she hadn't actually been playing. During her lunch breaks, she would sit in the garden and think about her old life. She remembered teaching piano lessons in her living room, watching children's faces light up when they finally played a song correctly. She remembered the Sunday afternoons when David would sit on the couch reading while she played, occasionally looking up to smile at her. But those memories hurt too much, so she tried to push them away. One Thursday morning, Robert announced that Mr. Whitmore would be traveling to New York for business meetings. He would be gone for 3 days. The house felt different when he wasn't there, lighter somehow. Even Mrs. Chen seemed to hum while she cooked. "It's nice when he's away," Tom the gardener said during lunch. "Don't get me wrong, he's not a bad man, just sad, you know. The whole house feels sad when he's here." Margaret understood exactly what Tom meant. Mr. Whitmore carried his sadness like a heavy coat that he never took off. It weighed down everything around him. That evening, Margaret finished her regular cleaning routine earlier than usual. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Robert had gone to visit his sister. Mrs. Chen had left after dinner. Tom lived in the small cottage by the garden. Margaret was completely alone with the piano. She told herself she was just going to dust it one more time. She walked into the living room with her cleaning cloth, but her feet seemed to move on their own toward the piano bench. Before she knew it, she was sitting down. The bench was the perfect height. Her feet touched the pedals naturally. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. It had been 2 years, 4 months, and 16 days since she had last played piano. She knew the exact count because she had been marking time like a prisoner, counting days until freedom. Margaret looked around the empty room. The family photos were still turned face down. The heavy curtains blocked most of the evening light. No one would know. No one would hear. She pressed middle C with her right index finger. The sound was pure and clear, echoing off the high ceiling. The piano was perfectly tuned, which surprised her. Someone had been taking care of it even though no one played it. Her left hand joined her right hand on the keys. She started with simple scales, her fingers remembering their old patterns. It was like riding a bicycle after years of walking. Awkward at first, then natural, then joyful. The music room in her old house had been small and cramped. This living room was enormous, and the sound filled every corner. The piano's voice was rich and warm, better than any instrument she had ever played. Without thinking, Margaret began playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It was the first piece she had learned when she was 16, the same piece she had played at her wedding while David waited at the altar. The same piece she used to play when she felt sad or happy or needed to remember who she was underneath all of life's problems. Her fingers found every note perfectly. The music poured out of her like water that had been held back by a dam. She closed her eyes and let the melody carry her away from the big house, away from her uniform, away from all the worry and fear that had been her constant companions for 2 years. She played the whole piece without stopping, adding her own small changes the way she always had. A little extra softness here, a pause there, making the music her own. When she finished, the last note hung in the air like a question waiting for an answer. Margaret sat in the silence, feeling more like herself than she had in months. Her cheeks were wet with tears she didn't remember crying. Playing again felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. She was about to start another piece when she heard something that made her blood freeze. Footsteps. Someone was walking down the hallway toward the living room. Heavy footsteps. Men's dress shoes on marble floors. Mr. Whitmore was supposed to be in New York. His flight wasn't supposed to return until tomorrow night. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. Maybe his trip was canceled. Maybe he came back early. Maybe he had never actually left. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room entrance. Margaret's hands shook as she quietly closed the piano lid. She grabbed her cleaning cloth and started dusting the piano frantically, trying to look like she had been working the whole time. Her heart was beating so hard, she was sure it could be heard across the room. She waited for Mr. Whitmore to walk in and fire her on the spot. She waited for him to shout at her for touching his wife's piano. She waited for her new life to end before it had really begun. But the footsteps didn't come into the room. They just stood there, outside the doorway, as still as stone. Margaret didn't dare turn around. She kept dusting the same spot on the piano over and over, wondering if this was how her story would end. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay in her small bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of what had happened. The footsteps had eventually walked away, but she never saw who they belonged to. Maybe it was Robert coming back, early. Maybe it was Tom checking the house. Maybe it was her imagination playing tricks on her worried mind. But deep down, she knew it had been Mr. Whitmore. She got up before her alarm and stood at her window, watching the sun come up over the garden. In a few hours she would know her fate. Either Mr. Whitmore would pretend nothing happened or she would be packing her suitcase again. The thought of leaving made her stomach hurt. Not just because she needed the job, but because for the first time in 2 years she had felt like herself again. Those 20 minutes at the piano had reminded her that Margaret, the person, still existed underneath Margaret the housekeeper. She put on her uniform with shaking hands and walked to the kitchen for breakfast. Mrs. Chen was already there, making scrambled eggs and toast. "You look tired, dear," Mrs. Chen said, not looking up from the stove. "Everything okay?" Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. She poured herself coffee and sat at the small staff table, but she couldn't eat anything. Her stomach was twisted, in knots. Robert appeared in the doorway at exactly 7 o'clock, just like every morning. His expression gave nothing away. "Mrs. Santos," he said, in his formal voice, "Mr. Whitmore would like to see you in the kitchen." This was it. Margaret had never been called to meet Mr. Whitmore anywhere except his office, and that was only on her first day. Being asked to the kitchen meant he wanted to fire her somewhere private, away from his workspace. She followed Robert through the familiar hallways, her legs feeling weak. When they reached the kitchen, Robert stepped aside and gestured for her to go in alone. Mr. Whitmore was sitting at the small breakfast table where the staff usually ate. He had never sat there before. In front of him were 2 coffee cups, both steaming. He looked up when she entered, and his face was different somehow. Softer. The hard lines around his eyes seemed less deep. "Please sit down," he said, pointing to the chair across from him. Margaret sat carefully, keeping her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. She stared at the coffee cup in front of her, waiting for the words that would end everything. "Came back early from New York," Mr. Whitmore said quietly. "My meetings finished sooner than expected." Margaret nodded but didn't speak. Her throat felt too tight for words. "I heard music when I came in last night." Piano music. Here it comes, Margaret thought. She closed her eyes and waited. My wife used to play that piece, Mr. Whitmore continued. His voice was different than she had ever heard it. Gentler, almost broken. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. She played it every evening after dinner. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at him. He was staring at his coffee cup, lost in some distant memory. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know I shouldn't have touched it. I'll pack my things. Mr. Whitmore looked up sharply. No, he said. Don't apologize, He paused, searching for words. I haven't heard music in this house for 15 years. I forgot how it felt to have these walls come alive. Margaret blinked in confusion. This wasn't what she had expected at all. Elena, my wife, she died of cancer, Mr. Whitmore said, his voice barely above a whisper. She fought for 2 years, but in the end, he shook his head. After she died, I couldn't bear to hear music anymore. It reminded me too much of her, of us, of everything I had lost. He picked up his coffee cup, but didn't drink from it. His hands were shaking slightly. I moved the piano out of our bedroom, because I couldn't stand seeing it every day. But I couldn't sell it either. It was too much a part of her, so it just sits there, silent, like everything else in this house. Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes. She had lived in this house for 3 weeks and never realized how much pain lived here with them. Last night, when I heard you playing, Mr. Whitmore continued, for a moment I thought she had come back. I stood in that hallway and listened to every note, and I could almost see her sitting there the way she used to. He looked directly at Margaret for the first time since she had started working for him. Really looked at her like he was seeing her as a person instead of just another piece of furniture. You play beautifully, he said. Where did you learn? Margaret's voice came out as a croak. My mother taught me when I was little. Then I studied music in college. I used to teach lessons. She paused. Before everything changed. What changed? My husband got sick. Cancer. Like your wife. We spent everything trying to save him, but... She shrugged, the gesture carrying 2 years of grief and struggle. They sat in silence for a moment. 2 people who had lost everything that mattered sharing the weight of their sadness. The piano needs to be played, Mr. Whitmore said finally. Elena always said that pianos die a little bit every day they stay silent. She would hate knowing that hers has been quiet for so long. Margaret didn't know what to say. Was he giving her permission? Was this some kind of test? I don't want you to stop, he said, reading the confusion on her face. I want you to play, every evening if you'd like. Consider it part of your duties. Margaret stared at him. You want me to play piano as part of my job? For the first time since she had known him, Mr. Whitmore almost smiled. Elena would have liked you, he said. She would have said that music is medicine, and this house has been sick for too long. He stood up from the table, looking lighter somehow, as if sharing his story had lifted some invisible weight from his shoulders. Thank you, Mrs. Santos, he said, for bringing music back to this house, for bringing Elena back, just for a few minutes. As he walked toward the door, he paused and turned back. Play whatever you want, he said, but if you wouldn't mind, could you play that Chopin piece again sometime? I'd like to remember what it sounds like when someone plays it with love. The next evening, Margaret approached the piano with nervous excitement. Mr. Whitmore had given her permission, but she still felt like she was doing something forbidden. She sat at the bench and looked around the empty living room, half expecting him to change his mind and tell her to stop. She started with something simple, a gentle melody her mother had taught her when she was 7 years old. The notes floated through the house like a warm breeze, chasing away some of the sadness that seemed to live in the walls. Halfway through the song, she noticed a shadow in the doorway. Mr. Whitmore stood there, not moving, just listening. When she finished, he nodded once and walked away without saying anything. But Margaret could swear she saw something different in his face, something that looked almost like peace. The next night, he appeared in the doorway again. This time he stayed for 2 songs before leaving quietly. By the end of the week, he had moved from the doorway to the hallway, where he could hear better but still stay hidden. Margaret began to understand that Mr. Whitmore wasn't ready to sit and listen openly. The music was medicine for him, but he needed to take it slowly, like someone recovering from a long illness. Their morning coffee meetings became a regular thing, though neither of them planned it that way. Mr. Whitmore would appear in the kitchen around 7:30 with 2 cups, and they would sit at the small table talking about simple things: the weather, the garden, how the piano sounded the night before. Slowly, their conversations grew deeper. Margaret learned that Mr. Whitmore had 2 children, a son and daughter in their 20s who rarely visited anymore. "They think I'm cold," he admitted one morning, stirring sugar into his coffee. "They're not wrong. After Elena died, I didn't know how to be their father anymore. I threw myself into work because it was easier than dealing with the pain." Margaret understood completely. "After David died, I stopped teaching piano lessons," she said. "The parents would ask how I was doing, and I couldn't handle their sympathy. It was easier to clean houses where nobody knew my story." "Do you miss teaching?" "Every day," Margaret said honestly. "There's something magical about watching a child play their first real song. Their faces light up like they've discovered fire." Mr. Whitmore smiled, a real smile, not the polite one he used for business calls. "Elena used to say the same thing about her art classes. She taught painting to kids at the community center." As the weeks passed, the house began to feel different. Mrs. Chen started humming while she cooked. Tom whistled while he worked in the garden. Even Robert seemed less stiff, occasionally making small jokes during their morning briefings. The evening concerts became the heart of the house's new rhythm. Margaret would finish her regular duties, then sit at the piano for an hour. She played everything she could remember: classical pieces, old folk songs, melodies from movies, even some pop songs she had learned years ago when teenage students requested them. Mr. Whitmore's listening post changed nightly. Sometimes he stood in the doorway. Sometimes he sat on the stairs where he could hear but not be seen. One evening, Margaret noticed he had moved Elena's favorite armchair closer to the living room entrance. 3 months after that first night, something remarkable happened. Margaret was playing a soft lullaby when she heard footsteps approaching. But instead of stopping in the doorway, they came into the room. Mr. Whitmore walked slowly to Elena's chair and sat down. His hands gripped the armrests tightly, and Margaret could see he was fighting some internal battle. But he stayed. Margaret kept playing, pretending not to notice how his eyes filled with tears or how his breathing changed when she played certain songs. She understood that this was a huge step for him, like someone afraid of water finally putting their toe in the ocean. When she finished the lullaby, he spoke in a voice thick with emotion. "Elena used to play that song when our children were babies," he said. "I used to fall asleep listening to it." "It's beautiful," Margaret said softly. "Would you like me to play it again?" He nodded, unable to speak. As Margaret played the lullaby a second time, Mr. Whitmore closed his eyes and let the memories wash over him. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't fighting the pain of remembering. He was letting it exist, alongside the beauty. Their friendship deepened after that night. Mr. Whitmore began sharing stories about Elena, how they met at college, their first dance, the way she laughed at his terrible jokes. Margaret shared memories of David, his love of crossword puzzles, how he made pancakes shaped like animals, the way he always fell asleep during movies. They discovered they both loved old books, rainy afternoons, and coffee that was too strong. Margaret learned that Mr. Whitmore had wanted to be a teacher before he became successful in business. Mr. Whitmore learned that Margaret had dreams of opening her own music school someday. "Why don't you teach again?" he asked one morning. Margaret laughed, but it sounded sad. "Who would hire me? I'm 52 years old with a 2-year gap in my resume. Besides, I don't have a piano anymore." "You have one now," Mr. Whitmore said quietly. Margaret looked at him in surprise. "That's your wife's piano." "Elena always said music should be shared, not hoarded," he replied. "She would love knowing that children were learning to play on her piano. The idea planted itself in Margaret's mind like a seed. Teaching again. Watching young faces discover the magic of music. Using Elena's beautiful piano to pass on the gift that had saved her own life. But it seemed too good to be true, too much to hope for. Mr. Whitmore seemed to read her thoughts. "Think about it," he said. "This house has been quiet for too long. Maybe it's time to fill it with more than just evening concerts." As Margaret walked through the house that day, she could almost hear it, the sound of children laughing, learning, discovering music for the first time. The house that had been a tomb for 15 years was ready to become a home again. 2 weeks after their conversation about teaching, Mr. Whitmore knocked on Margaret's door at 8 in the evening. She had just finished her piano session and was getting ready for bed when she heard the gentle tapping. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," he said when she opened the door, "but I have an idea and I couldn't wait until morning to share it." He looked different, more alive than she had ever seen him. There was excitement in his eyes, the kind she imagined he used to have when he was building his first company. "What if we converted Elena's old art studio into a proper music room?" he said, the words tumbling out quickly. "It has great acoustics, lots of natural light, and it's been empty for 15 years. We could get a second piano, maybe some chairs for parents to sit and listen." Margaret stared at him, not sure she had heard correctly. "You want to turn your wife's art studio into a place where I teach piano lessons?" "Elena would love it," he said firmly. She always said that empty rooms were the saddest things in the world. She believed spaces were meant to be filled with creativity and learning and joy. The next morning, Mr. Whitmore led Margaret to a part of the house she had never seen before. Elena's art studio was on the second floor, with big windows that looked out over the garden. Canvases covered in dust sheets lined the walls. Brushes and paint sat exactly where Elena had left them, as if she had just stepped out for a moment. "I haven't been in here since she died," Mr. Whitmore admitted, his voice quiet. "I couldn't bear to pack up her things, but I couldn't stand to look at them either." Margaret walked around the room slowly, imagining how it could look. There was enough space for a piano, music stands, maybe even a small seating area. The morning, light streaming through the windows would be perfect for reading sheet music. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. This was her special place. Mr. Whitmore picked up one of Elena's paintbrushes, running his finger along the dried bristles. "She used to say that the worst thing you could do to art was lock it away where no one could see it. The same is true for music, don't you think?" The next month, the transformation began. Mr. Whitmore hired people to clean and repaint the room. He bought a second piano, not as grand as the Steinway, but perfect for teaching. He had comfortable chairs brought in and music stands placed around the room. Margaret helped pack Elena's art supplies carefully in boxes. They didn't throw anything away, but stored it all in a climate-controlled room where it would be safe. Mr. Whitmore kept one painting on the wall, a landscape Elena had painted of their garden in spring, full of bright flowers and singing birds. She would want something beautiful to watch over the music lessons, he explained. But the biggest surprise came when Mr. Whitmore made an announcement that shocked everyone in the house. "I'm offering you a new position," he told Margaret one morning over their coffee. "Not as a housekeeper, but as my personal assistant and house manager. The salary is, well, it's enough that you'll never have to worry about money again." Margaret's hands shook as she set down her coffee cup. "I don't understand." "You've brought this house back to life," Mr. Whitmore said simply. "You've reminded me how to be human again. I don't want you cleaning toilets and dusting furniture. I want you to help me run things, manage the household staff, and yes, teach piano lessons to any child whose family wants them to learn." The tears came before Margaret could stop them. "But I'm just a housekeeper. I don't have business experience." "You have something more valuable," Mr. Whitmore said. "You have wisdom, kindness, and the ability to see what people really need. Besides, Elena always said the best managers are the ones who care about people, not just profits." The music school opened quietly, with just 3 students at first. Word spread slowly through the neighborhood about the woman who taught piano, in the big house on the hill. Parents were curious but cautious. After all, Mr. Whitmore had a reputation for being cold and unfriendly. But when they met Margaret, they saw immediately that she was different. She listened to their children with patience and understanding. She celebrated every small victory and turned every mistake into a learning opportunity. The first time Mr. Whitmore heard children's laughter echoing through his house in 15 years, he stood in his office doorway and smiled. The sound was like sunshine breaking through clouds after a long storm. Margaret's first student was a shy 7-year-old girl whose family had just moved to town. During her third lesson, the little girl managed to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star all the way through without stopping. Her face lit up with such pure joy that Margaret felt her own heart fill with happiness. "Did you hear me play?" the little girl asked excitedly. "I did it all by myself." "I heard," Margaret said, giving her a gentle hug. "You were wonderful." 6 months later, the music school had 12 regular students. The house rang with scales and simple melodies during the day, and Margaret still played her evening concerts for Mr. Whitmore, who now sat openly in Elena's chair and sometimes even requested specific songs. His children started visiting again, drawn by curiosity about the changes in their father. They were amazed to find him laughing with Margaret about something funny one of the students had said, or discussing plans for a small recital in the garden. "Dad seems happy," his daughter whispered to Margaret one afternoon. "I haven't seen him like this since before Mom died." "Music heals everything given enough time," Margaret replied, watching Mr. Whitmore help a young student adjust his posture at the piano. On the anniversary of that first night when Margaret had played Chopin's Nocturne, she and Mr. Whitmore sat in the living room after the students had gone home. The house was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet now, not the heavy silence of grief. "Do you ever regret it?" Mr. Whitmore asked. "Giving up your old life for this one?" Margaret looked around the room, at the piano that had saved her, at the photos that were no longer face down, at the man who had become her dearest friend. "I didn't give up my old life," she said softly. "I found my new one, and it's more beautiful than I ever imagined it could be." Outside, the garden was full of spring flowers, just like in Elena's painting. And somewhere in the house, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear the echo of music and laughter, proving that the saddest places can become the happiest ones if you just give them time to heal.